Apologies for the slow start as well. As always, technology was proving challenging. But with that, I will stop talking and I will very kindly hand over to John, who is one of our executive team members and a member, also a manager at Monash University, and David Hurst, who some of you might recall, who used to be one of us, one of our I guess team members in working in health and safety in the university, but has now changed teams somewhat, but still working to the same aim. So David Hurst is now a member of Riskware, but what John and David are going to talk about is the Rewire project. And I know this is a term that we've been banding around a little bit, but we're really going to get into the nuts and bolts of what it is, how we've got there, and what, again, looking to the future and what we're going to do with it. So thank you, John and David.
Okay, thank you, Teresa. Thank you for the introduction. Before we start, I'd also like to acknowledge the Kaurna people, who are the traditional custodians of the Adelaide Plains, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. My involvement in the Rewire project is quite recent compared to some of the other team members. I got a phone call from Scott Burnell, who you might recall was the former president of AUSA. Scott was moving organisations, and he said, look, John, I'd really want you to take over the running of this project. And I'm thinking, oh God, another thing on my plate. But look, I thought it was a good body of work that we didn't want to lose. And there was a lot of work put into it by a whole range of team members. So I obliged, and I said, I'm happy to take on the project. Now, moving forward, we organised meetings and the like to get this project over the line. But what actually occurred back at the 2016 conference, the concept of identifying and classifying data for the purposes of reporting and benchmarking incidents and hazards related safety metrics between institutions had been discussed over many, many years. We wanted to compare apples with apples, but everyone had their own classification that was just a hodgepodge and mix of all sorts of things. And a lot of institutions sort of ran by the seat of their pants and changed things as they went. So at the AUSA conference in 2016, a workshop led by Monash University proposed a working group be formed on a classification framework to be used in the sector. So what came out of that is that at this workshop, many of the universities expressed a common desire to compare incident and hazard data across the sector. However, at this time, benchmarking was challenging due to the diverse ways in which the data was classified and categorised within the tertiary and education and research sector. Whilst many institutions had adopted the type of occurrence classifications, the TOOCS system, for classification of incident and hazard data, this system was predominantly designed for classification of workers' compensation data, and neglected to accommodate occurrences where harm did not transpire. So, and furthermore, the classification of emergent incident and near-miss data was limited. For example, the introduction of the psychosocial hazard classifications. In addition, other evaluated classification systems tended to focus on high-risk sectors such as mining, construction, or agriculture, and were not really considered to align well with the tertiary education and research institution sector application. So in order to facilitate consistency and standardisation within the sector, it was acknowledged that a tailored classification system relevant to the risk profile of the sector was required. So ongoing discussions led to the establishment of a working group in 2020 known as Project Rewire. The Foundation Rewire Working Group members comprised of representatives from 4 universities. They were David Hurst, who at that stage was working for Monash University, Scott Burnell from Griffith University, Kieran Roach from RMIT, and Narelle McCallum from the University of Queensland. Okay, so at this stage, I might hand over to David to take you through the next phase.
Thanks, JT. Do I need a mic? Yep. How does this one work? Does that work? 1, 2, 1, 2. Great. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Yeah, so just catching up with Rewire, just a quick run through of phase 1, which was really the majority of 2020. The focus was on alignment. So the 4 participating universities really talked a lot about what things they were aiming for and what differences we had with the various systems. So the first area that we talked about was the workflow process, and what we're talking about is the stages of responding to health and safety. We recognised some significant differences in the way certain types of reports were managed, whether it was a hazard or a near miss, and for example, if it was a confidential type report, whether it was treated in different ways. The second area of alignment was in the classifications, and I have to admit, we all got to know each other very well during these discussions, as there was a significant amount of variation in the way classifications were being used, which was fascinating given that we were actually all using the same piece of software. But the way that the question had been interpreted, the way that perhaps organically the packages had been deployed, led to some very interesting variation in what one person thought was an activity and one person thought was a time category. And then we started to look at the broader suite of reporting tools used, things like risk assessment, audits and inspections. And there was a very strong sense that that was going to be a lot of work, and that even just getting hazards and incidents to an aligned state would be an excellent first goal. So phase 1, the scene was set to really work through that alignment. And the outcome of that was that we did come up with a set of agreed classifications, albeit as mentioned, with some degree of challenge. But we also started to recognise some real issues with the way the implementation sat that prevented us from really realising that the stated objectives at the start. Thanks, Charles. So the first area was really in the way the software was working for a tertiary organisation, and that really prevented some of the ideas of solutions to things like the structure of classifications. The second area of limitation was that none of us really knew what we were talking about when it came to psychosocial risks, and that none of us could even break the first step in terms of, is a traumatic event a mechanism or an agency? Where does the data sit in regards to the software? Sorry, Rory, I'm just going to put that to mute. Okay, so phase 2, then the scene was set for phase 2, which sort of split out into 2 parallel bits of work. The first one was to really start looking at the software limitations and come up with a strategy. And the second area was to get more serious about psychosocial risk. So in regards to the software limitations, as I mentioned, all of the member organisations were using the same software, and that was a real boon because at least we could sort of agree on the general sense of the question we were trying to answer. But it was also a challenge because whenever you start with something that's fixed, your thinking becomes fixed. And so we're often finding ourselves cycling around an argument that ultimately revolved from a core design of the software that we were using. And no matter how we approached it, as long as we accepted that core design, we probably weren't going to be able to break out of that conversation. And I'm talking about 2-hour-long meetings with one item on the agenda. So credit to all the members for the patience to stick through those conversations. We're all still friends, believe it or not. And that software was, of course, Riskware, where I'm now employed. The providers of Riskware Pan software expressed a strong desire to collaborate. They listened carefully to the feedback from Rewire and acknowledged that the design of the system at the time would not be able to adjust and incorporate the sorts of feedback coming from the Rewire project. So they made a commitment to work in a collaborative co-design capacity and effectively joined Rewire for that period, which was approximately 9 months. to really sit in, listen to the detail around how the classifications are working or not working, the workflow, etc., to really gain an appreciation for where the software needs to move. So the outcome of that was a revised software, a new generation of software that Griffith University implemented at the start of 2022. Monash has gone live at the end of Q3, and UQ is just kicking off its roadmap now. So in terms of form implementation, I might come back. I'll go into these now. There's sort of a few areas that really emerged. So number one was the idea of mechanism and agency, and this was coming from the TOOC system, as John mentioned, which was really built around a post-incident diagnosis conducted by someone with a high degree of training. The goal for an incident reporting tool in the university sector is to move that classification as close to the first responder as possible. There's obviously some discussion there about whether that's the person that was affected, a supervisor, or somebody with a higher degree of experience. But in any case, it's not necessarily, a highly qualified health and safety practitioner. And so the list as it was presented in the software at the start of Rewire was a single flat list, essentially a single set of options. So the first thing we realized was that if you had about more than 14 options, users just became overwhelmed. It's just too long a list. They're not going to be able to find something. The second thing we realized was that we needed way more than 14 items. When we looked at agency of harm, which is essentially it's essentially anything, the object, material, substance, event that led to harm, you're essentially coding the world. So how can we possibly set up a code that's intuitive for a student to code out the difference between an individual thread of a carpet and the sun? So the first goal was to implement a hierarchy in the data. And so here's an example from the Monash environment. I don't know if that's big enough for everyone to see, but this is the same list that's in your standard. So it's not news. So with a hierarchy, we can now break that information down for a basic user and give them some guidance on what's going to be hiding behind. So we've got biological, environment, materials, plant, psychosocial, transport, and recently sport. If we dive into any of those categories, we can provide some more guidance. So I mentioned the sun. That was a really interesting conversation. How do we code for sunburn? What's the agency there? It's effectively the sun. So we needed to talk about the environment, the natural world. But if you just put the sun in there, it's not very intuitive. So coming up with these sorts of things like weather, disaster, vegetation, and water bodies gives the user some sort of idea of where they might find something. But now we have that other problem where we now have a ginormous list. If you look at the Rewire standard, pages of options. So we need a quick way for the users to locate that. So we recognize ideally a search capacity to be able to search for categories based on the user's input. And my suspicion is with that sort of technology that these categories are going to become more detail centric, because users are going to be looking for something, and if they want to search, they're going to have a code word in mind. Having a bit more detail in the categories, whereas when you've got a single list, you almost want the opposite. You want to bring it back. So that's the agency list. Similarly for the mechanism list, I've got to pick something up the top, don't I? I'll just use a hazard for now. Similarly for the mechanism list, here we go. The first recognition was that our list was very heavily focused on physical harm, physical mechanisms. So we expanded that out quite quickly, but realized that there's certain categories that really belong as subcategories. A classic example being falls at the same height, falls from more than 2 meters. So coming up with some structure there to enable the user to hone into what they want. With the mechanism, it became obvious that sometimes you didn't really need the user to dig right down. So another change that was implemented was the capacity just to select at any level of the hierarchy. So at least you're getting some information without them trying to get the exact fit. The second area was in the wording. So this is all captured in the standard. So the old forms that we were using in Rewire had some wording around what happened, what was this, but we found some of those terms, like what was the time category, very difficult for someone like a student to code. So there's recommended wording in there now about exactly what were you doing at the time, for example, rather than what was the time category. The third area was the way that the form led the user. So when, where, who, what, and the assignment. So fairly straightforward, but helped with the clarity for the user. And just what's a hazard, what's an incident, where does near miss sit? So that's all clarified in there. The second area of growth in Rewire was understanding psychosocial risk. It just so happened that my partner works at Monash University in the Turner Brain and Mental Health Research Centre, and was very interested in this topic at the time. And so I was able to connect across to a team that existed within their faculty that was already looking at psychosocial risk. So we essentially invited that team to collaborate with Rewire and start building out an idea of what sorts of information we need to be capturing within a form to properly appreciate psychosocial risk. So their working group was a little broader. They were really thinking about the whole of psychosocial risk within a faculty. And I hope that that team comes and presents to an AUSA at some point. But essentially understanding what the risks are within a faculty. This is medicine at Monash. What sort of language is going to be useful in that setting to communicate about psychosocial risk? What are the barriers to understanding and managing psychosocial risk? Such as the design of the form and what sort of training can be added. But they did find this chart early on, which I think is fantastic, which is a common sort of confusion about the distinction between well-being and risk management. When we talk about psychological risk, all too often we were falling into the trap of thinking that some psychosocial risks are well-being issues. So here we're identifying the proactive side, or the high-performing, high-functioning side of an organisation in managing these things is certainly well-being, but the identification and management of acute and chronic conditions is at the risk management end. So you want both. So 4 key areas came out of the collaboration there. The first is that branching category, which I demonstrated earlier. So we recognise that users don't always think about psychological type risks when putting in an incident report. It's not their first thought. Invariably, they're thinking about the physical components first. Often psychosocial risks are coming in partnership or in tandem with physical risks. And so if you don't clearly separate those two, we run the risk that the user will slip back into that thinking. We want to encourage them to carefully consider where the impact lies. And so the first change was to basically split mechanism at the start into physical and psychological. There were some categories that sat in the middle, a good example being sleep deprivation, where you start wondering, is it physical or is it psychological? And of course, if you think about holistic health models, that argument's sort of a bit null and void. We are one organism and our health is holistic. But when it comes to reporting harm from the workplace, it is a useful distinction to start with, to go primarily which model of health should we look at it from. However, that opened up the second area, which is that in many cases with incidents, there may be multiple forms of harm, and indeed the most obvious thing is not the most serious. So a number of changes came out of that. Firstly, that you can add multiple harm models, again with that physical and psychological, but also the inclusion of this Wong-Baker approach to quickly evaluate, well, which one is very serious. So if I've reported 3 injuries, which one do I want the team to hone in on? Good. So that really concluded the work that I was involved in. So we basically implemented those forms, and as mentioned, various organisations have gone live. And at the start of 2020, I moved on to a different opportunity. So I'll hand back to John.
Thanks, David. I'll just turn that one off, close one. Okay, so phase 3, publication of the standard. So just a bit of background, as mentioned at the beginning, in 2022, Scott and David moved on to different roles. So they left the university sector. So myself, Leanne Thebridge from University of New South Wales, Kieran Roach from RMIT were asked to run with the project. So we went to see it right through to deployment. During this phase, the document went out for consultation. We took the feedback on board and decided to change and add, modify the document, and then resend it out for consultation again. And at this point, I'll just mention that Kieran Roach from RMIT, he hated having the classification other in the document for obvious reasons, because everyone would just pick other because it's simple. That was worked out of the document, but again, through the consultation phase, other crept back in. we ran, when we went live with the document at Monash, we left other in there just to see what would happen. And we obviously identified that people were picking other because they were too lazy to classify other categories. So we actually just removed it. So it makes the data more relevant. So the next step was we're focusing on publication. So we met with the AUSA executive, took it through certain stages with them, and we obviously had the consolidation period, and the completion for publication. So consultation, that occurred in Q1 2022. Consolidation, that's when Scott called me in April, said, you're taking over the project. So we did a bit of consolidation, and then we went to the completion in Q3 2022, where the AUSA executive actually endorsed the standard. And then we went to publication this quarter. Okay, so review outcome to date. Obviously, the whole idea was to demonstrate and align multiple tertiary sector organisations, as I mentioned in the beginning. Improvement to reporting tools, so we can compare apples with apples. Categories were consolidated, subcategories expanded, and I just want to add at this point, this document isn't set in concrete, so it's a continual improvement process. You know, some universities might find that some things work for them depending on the types of activities they do. Others, again, they might find other things that suits them. So the whole idea of this standard is to review and enhance it over time. So we've gone for a 6-month period. I mean, I'm working on the Monash line, depending on when other universities take the standard up. But the proof's in the pudding. So you think you've got everything aligned, and then when you run with it, you find that there are certain tweaks that need to occur. And those tweaks are quite important, because it absolutely makes the document more user-friendly. And then, you know, as I mentioned at the beginning, then we can start to compare apples with apples. Okay. So where to from here? So implementing the classifications in the reporting tool, understanding what's working and what isn't, as I mentioned before, and the continual improvement process, with the idea of revisiting mid-2023 to see how it's all running and to make any adjustments. I just also want to thank all the working group members, which are listed there, and everyone's had quite a bit of input, which is, it's quite refreshing to see that the sector is aligned and working towards a common goal. So hopefully this will turn out to be a great body of work. I actually thank the AUSA executive for actually endorsing the standard in early October. And it's a matter of where to from here. So I'm going to open up the floor. David, did you want to, or Teresa? Yeah. Thanks, David.
Thanks, guys. That was really good. And I think what I'm overwhelmed by is we've got a true international Australasian theme with the partners that have been involved in this as well. A couple of disclaimers I'm just going to give is that the demonstration that David just gave was one software. Yes. By no means does that mean it excludes members who don't use that particular software. So the standard has been written that regardless of what system, even if it's paper-based, if you follow the classifications, we will all end up with data that's comparable. So I think that's the key thing, is that we want to be, I think the power of our association is that we are all in similar situations. So if we can use ourselves to benchmark against one another, I know that's what, in particular, that's what I get asked for a lot from our executive. So we want to know how we're comparing to others. So I think having that comparison is great. And I also really like, David, as well, when you talk through the process the association went through to come up with this. There is a real human factors consideration in it as well. How many choices are too many? How many questions can we ask before someone's going to shut out? So I think it's a great opportunity. It's actually the first publication that AUSA has put out as well. So we're really looking at how can we provide benefit to our members? How can we provide value? And this is just the first, hopefully, of a few. So I think Charles just shared a web link, and the people in the audience, we've just been given a hard copy, but hopefully the guys online, you've got access to a web link, and that's available on the website as well. So really, I guess I'm keen to hear from the members and the people in the room. Where do we want to take this? How do we think uptake's going to go? What do we need to see? And I think another important point that John mentioned as well is that this is a continuous improvement cycle. So it's not set in stone, but it's only going to be as good as the effort that each of us put in and the data that we get to share at the end. So with that, questions, comments, feedback, anything anyone would like to add in the room or online? Charles, please.
During one of the plenary sessions in yesterday's conference, there was talk about Indigenous data and the fact that that is restricting the amount of analysis that can be done because we aren't collecting in our work-related injury data, whether it's occurring to an Indigenous person or somebody that identifies as being Indigenous. So is this something that was considered at all in the Rewire project? And if not, is it something that we think should be included? So I know that there's a number of bodies that are working with regulators to try and get this data included in what they're capturing. But of course, if organisations aren't capturing it, it's very difficult for bodies to collect that. So is that something that the university sector should be leading in terms of capturing that information?
Oh. I'll start the response. It was certainly considered quite early on, and a number of other personal coding information. So data that identifies and I guess allows us demographic information. So perhaps another really obvious example is the age of the person, or indeed the gender that they identify. The decision was made very early on to essentially out of scope this for the purposes of the standard, because that data belongs with the organisation in their people management side. So it goes to beyond health and safety. There are a number of other areas where that information is required. And so rather than ask that user to tell us, which I know some users can find quite frustrating when they feel like they've told an organisation something and then they're asked repeatedly to keep reaffirming that, the decision was to essentially collect that information from a data set outside the hazard incident reporting. That is not a perfect decision, and it did come up during our initial stages in things like agency, where you're talking about the source of harm. There are hazards that uniquely apply to children, and there are hazards that uniquely or perhaps significantly apply to various minority communities and identifiable communities. Certainly by the time I handed over, that information was in the list, but I understand was then through perhaps a consultation adjusted again. So JT, did you want to expand?
Oh, I've looked at the consultation phase. Again, all the other universities had their input, and that was decided by majority to remove that in the initial stage and possibly look at putting that back in if required at a later stage. So we wanted to go with I know the document's quite thick, but we wanted to go with a simplified version in the beginning and then expand on it.
Okay, I'll have a more a comment rather than a question. I think yesterday in talking to the regulators, the four regulator heads, Australia has a national injury surveillance center that is based in Flinders, right here in Adelaide. But that center doesn't capture anything WHS related. So I was very curious and asking the regulators whether or not they would have anything, or they actually has anything. The answer is no. They don't capture anything. They said they should. That's more a suggestion for our executive to think about as an association. I think this is a really good opportunity, even just the numbers, not by detailed information, whether or not we would be leading on that practice.
Thanks, Shin. Did you guys want to respond on that? There was a bit of whispering going on. I was wondering what they were preparing for.
No, we were just looking at, we're thinking maybe it's showing a dashboard version. I don't know if you want to do that. Or if you want to log in,
I think one of the points I was just going to reflect on as well that kind of pulls back to Charles' point is obviously safety data has got a huge element of privacy around it as well. And how do we look to manage that? So maybe you can talk specifically about the standard more broadly. How do we think we're going to address privacy issues?
Yeah. Do you want me to go again?
Yeah, go again.
Okay. I do have a fairly unique position in being, I guess, representing an organisation that collects a lot of university data. And so I guess I'm well positioned to take a first crack at that question. We can disclose information for health and safety purposes, and we regularly do, and it does need to be carefully controlled. So that's number one. As long as we're operating within those controls, as long as the use of that data is for its intended collection purpose, we can move information around on a needs basis. So we do that at Pan Software, where one organisation wants to commit information over to another organisation, such as a form or a set of categories. And what we do is seek written consent from the organisations participating. To my knowledge, we've never moved personal information. That's not something that's ever come up, but it has been discussed. So I know in the tertiary setting, close to your heart perhaps, we have research institutes co-located and almost embedded within organisations. And in some cases, those organisations daisy chain off the other organisation's software. Other times have a standalone, and there's a need there to think carefully about what information can flow between these organisations. Sometimes it might get taken for granted, and we need to be very, very careful to say, by putting this here, you're also letting this other organisation know. But I guess the last point, very quickly, is that we can bring information down, aggregate it, to really remove a lot of the capacity for information to identify outside its intended purpose. So we use aggregates, we use line charts, we use simple measures to communicate what's happening in the sector, rather than supplying in bulk, an incident record with all the information. So I guess my perspective from a vendor would be to think carefully about what information would need to be shared. And that's ultimately going to be driven by what are the measures, the indicators that AUSA would agree to, and what are the core bits of information to do that. And I'll put one specific example in and then I'll hand over. LTIFR, it's a very common reporting requirement. It does require the use of the hours worked. And if you move that reporting tool down to small organizations, you can very quickly get very good information around exactly how big and what they're doing. So those sorts of measures need very significant thought and attention. Similarly, heat maps around geography are going to tell you where areas are, etc. But other indicators, simple summary measures, we are between this range. I would suggest have very little capacity to interfere with your privacy.
Yeah, I was just going to add that at Monash we have affiliate organisations who use our system, but we don't actually get to see their data. They use the system, but it's locked down specifically to them. So as David said, if we wanted to venture down that path of collaborating and working with our affiliates, we would have to have written authority to have a look at their data. So the privacy aspect is quite tightly controlled. The other thing I would just like to mention, and as I said, I'd like to congratulate the AUSA executive because I believe this is the first ever standard that AUSA has endorsed. So well done to the executive.
Sure is, and a lot of work's gone into it as well. But I think the conversation that we've just had shows that there is still work to be done, which you've all acknowledged through that as well. So I guess the challenge or the option to people is this standard going to work in your organisation? The more people that we get, or the more organisations we get adopting this, the more powerful. I mean, from an institutional point alone, you will get better data out of it as well. But then we will be able to compare. And I think that's a really exciting future in the next 12 months and beyond of how AUSA can stand together then and start looking across the education factor as a whole and look at how we're performing compared to others.
Yeah, one of the things that came up at the AUSA conference in 2016 was by sharing the data and benchmarking against other institutions, you can see where they're actually performing really well. So if one institution is performing really well in one area, you want to tap in to see what are they doing that we aren't doing to achieve that result. And by doing that, in AUSA we share information, and it's about bringing everyone up to speed and best practice, basically. So that's the whole aim of this standard.
Brilliant. Not reinventing the wheel.
Not reinventing the wheel. And I just want to reiterate as well, as Teresa mentioned, we're using a certain type of software for this to run our hazard incident reporting, but you can use it in other types of software, even paper-based systems, as Teresa mentioned. So we're not pushing one software over another, but we're pushing the standard.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. One more thought. Yeah. Go on then.
Maybe just a translation then of that might be another standard around benchmarking. I'm familiar with a few documents, and I believe the LTIFR is one published document that does ask organisations to standardise. So perhaps room for AUSA to grow. AUSA is a benchmarking reporting standard. Good luck.
LTIFR, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, gentlemen.